Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Eleanor. Today I would like to introduce you to a new kind of interactive video that I'm going to try out. And this will involve, if you like, going to a poem that was recently published on the internet, in this case on the Poetry Foundation website, and playing along with me and hopefully helping me with some responses. So here's the background, and I'll try to do this as quickly as possible because time is of the essence. So I did an intensive workshop. It was a 3-hour workshop that was with a poet called Elizabeth Metzger. She's a fascinating poet. I'll link to her. She turns out to be an amazing teacher. It's not often that you find a poet who is also able to lead a workshop in a very precise, planned way while allowing for conversation as well. And her workshop was on the lyric I. I think she called it Who Am I? And she went through several different poems, and we discussed who the person in the poem is who's speaking, whether they change at any point, and who are the people that the speaker is thinking of. It might be within the world of the poem, it might be a certain kind of reader. And it really illuminated a lot for me and changed the way I look at poems. Now, but back to my idea. One of the poems that she had us read and discuss was by an American poet called Gabrielle Calvacaresi. And this particular poem is called Miss You, Would Like to Take a Walk with You. If you'd like, you could pause, go to the link now, read the poem and then come back if you like, or you can listen through and then do that. It's an easy poem, don't worry. It's a very quick, easy poem. It's easy to read and it's easy to understand. There were maybe 9 or 10 of us in the workshop. It was via Zoom, and it felt from the responses that most of my fellow students just really, really loved, were very emotionally affected by this poem, and I was not. And so I thought, what's wrong with me? Which is usually what you feel like, because you feel peer pressure. So I wasn't, feeling this emotional connection with the poem. And so I jumped to the conclusion that maybe it's something to do with the craft. And I'm not certain that jump of odd logic was correct. But in any case, while they were all talking and waxing lyrical about the poem, I was looking at some parts of the craft, and I thought, maybe this and maybe that isn't really working very well, and that's the problem. And so I voiced that very hesitantly because I was a little self-conscious. And one of the other participants, one of my fellow students, made the point, a very, very good point in response to mine, that the craft of the poem, it really has nothing to do with, it doesn't necessarily have something to do with the emotional effect it has on the reader. What she was saying, and I take her point absolutely, is that sometimes a poem speaks to you and sometimes it doesn't. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the craft is good or bad. And you can't always point to craft as the answer. You can have a beautifully crafted, sophisticated poem that makes no emotional connection, and vice versa. I took her point, and then I realized that perhaps I wasn't connecting to the poem for another reason, which could be simply personal. But one of the words that came up in our discussion was the word sentimental. I use that word to describe this poem. I'd be curious if you thought this poem was sentimental. I felt that it was just a little bit too simplistic, at least until the very end. I felt that it was more a kind of hallmark poem. Now, why did the ending save the poem for me? If you look at the last lines, the last 3 lines, miss you, wish you would walk through my door. Okay, still, wish you would walk through my door. Snore, snore, no, cliche, boring, vapid. But then she does this thing, stare out from the mirror. So now I'm getting sort of like horror movie haunted vibes. And then after the full stop, come through, new line, the pipes. And the pipes, if you look at the poem, it's just the 2 words, the pipes. And that really, it sort of gave me shivers down my spine. That saved it for me because it was so unexpected. So that came out, well, that came out in the magazine actually, I see, in October 2021. Okay, so I'm thinking now, what makes a poem melancholy? I don't know. And, sorry, not melancholy. What makes a poem sentimental? And the next day I do another intensive workshop. This is through Brooklyn Poets with Edward Hirsch. Edward Hirsch is the Mr. Hirsch I talk about, who he compiled the big book I have, the Glossary of Poetic Terms, which I really enjoy. I really enjoy looking at from time to time. So here he comes, and he's going to talk about the writing and reading elegies. And he first of all, I should say, it took me aback a bit, because while fangirling him, because he is such a figure, you know, he's such a well-known figure in the American poetry world, and also having gone back to his glossary again and again, I feel that he's, you know, brought so much to my life in poetry. After fangirling him a bit, I realized here is an old school professor, and he's going to lecture. He's going to lecture, even though it's a Zoom craft lab. He's definitely going to have, you know, question and answers, but they're not discussions. And so, you know, I got used to that. That's okay. And he went through poems. He was extremely well prepared and illuminated many things for me, just as Elizabeth Metzger did in a different way. Her class was more of a communal event. His was more of a lecture. In any case, halfway through the class, I realized that all of the poems that he was presenting us with were elegies that were very heightened, very sophisticated, well, very, very carefully constructed and crafted poems. Were they comforting? No, not one of them was comforting. Were they sentimental? Absolutely not. If anything, they were more intellectual. They were linguistic examples of how you might think differently about people in your world who have died. They were, in a way, trying to embrace complexities of relationships, you know, within grief. So I wrote a question into the Q&A kind of form that you have on the Zoom, and I asked him if he thought that sentimental poems actually were written or are written to comfort people, and that these poems that he's presenting to us are not comforting. And he actually agreed. He agreed. He said, well, all the poems that I've shown you, you know, they're not comforting at all, unless, he said, unless you're someone like me who is comforted by language that embraces complexity and paradox. And, you know, I'm in two minds about that, because, you know, I agree. And of course, I'm sort of like that too, because I like that. But in a way, he was saying that the sentimental poems I'm not embracing truth. And I'm not prepared to really go down that route. And I'll tell you why. I'm a cynical personality, and I know this about myself. Now, I'm also a hopeless romantic, but I dislike oversimplified emotions. I don't find that romantic at all. So what do you do with sentimentality? If it embraces a part of life that is comforting, that could be truth as well. It might not be an intellectual truth, but it's definitely an emotional truth. And it is very subjective, isn't it? So he did say, and this is an interesting anecdote. So Edward Hirsch did say that his mother wrote poems, I think all her life, and they were very sentimental. And she also loved Hallmark cards. And she accused him a while back of not supporting her in her poetry writing. And he brought that up, didn't really comment further. And I thought that was super interesting. But for the relationship between mother and son, and the relationship between the intellectual way that he likes to look at poems, and his mother's more emotional way. So, what do you think makes for a sentimental poem? And I'm curious, particularly, if you find Calvacaressi's Miss You would like to take a walk with you. A, do you think it's sentimental? B, did it touch you emotionally? C, when you're thinking about someone you love dying, or dealing with a death, or looking back, historically at someone who has died, what are the sort of poems that you move towards? Do you feel very strongly one way or the other? I thought it was an interesting question to ask, and I'm really very curious. Okay, thank you very much. I'll leave that there. I'm really looking forward to reading your comments. And don't forget, the only real property is the property of the mind. I'll see you next time, and thank you.